Hi, and welcome to Essay 2 Arrangement. In this lesson, we're going to talk about a guide to sorting and making an outline. Now, before we do that, a quick review. You'll remember from the introductory lesson that there are 3 challenges and 3 solutions to writing. The challenge of coming up with something to say, ordering your thoughts, and expressing your thoughts appropriately. And in the introductory lesson, we described that, but then in Essay 1, Leah described for you some ways to come up with something to say, the invention process we call it. And that's where you start with a question, you turn the question into an issue, and then you complete an ANI or an Annie chart. And then she took what she developed there and made a very rudimentary outline, and from that wrote a very rudimentary essay. Well, you probably noticed that there wasn't really a whole lot of content in that essay. So what we're going to talk about in Essay 2 is how to solve that problem. Well, what we did talk about in Essay 2, invention, is how to solve that problem, and we created a new problem. We used the 5 topics of invention, and suddenly there's so much information that you can't just move it over and make an easy outline. Now we need to sort what we came up with in invention, and that's what we're going to talk about in the arrangement lesson. There's actually a simple point to it, let's say a simple idea to this lesson with 2 parts. And the first is that we're going to take that information and put it into groups. The second is we're then going to use those groups to make the outline for Essay 2. Now, one caution I'll give you, one suggestion I'll give you is that when it comes to sorting, it is extremely important that you as a teacher be patient with your students. And that's because for us as adults, typically it's fairly easy to sort things and we think more abstractly, but for the middle school child, they haven't spent a lot of time doing that yet. So if you've got a 7th, 8th, or even 6th grade student working on this material, they won't find it as easy as you might expect them to find it, perhaps, when it comes to sorting. So my encouragement here is to be very patient with them, to be very concrete with them, and to give them lots of repetition and practice. Now, here's what we're going to do. I want to outline for you 6, 7 steps that we're going to do in this essay, and then I'll model it for you. Okay, now, the first thing you want to do when you sort the information, remember that it's on an Annie chart already. Okay, and I've actually put it up here, an A and an I, and you can find this very content in your teacher's guide somewhere in the Essay 2 arrangement lesson material. So what we need to do first is make sure that any of the I material, you remember that stands for indeterminate or interesting or whatever, any I material that can be moved over to the A or the N should be moved. And for example, we see here Edmund was lost. E just means Edmund and W means White Witch. Edmund was lost. Well, we do find that right over here. Where do we find it? Edmund is lost in the A column. So that moved over. A number of them did not move over, and that's fine. Those are judgment calls. So first, make sure that any I's that can be moved to A or N get moved over. Second, what we're going to do is go through the A column, and we're going to group this information. We're going to make 5 groups. Then we'll go to the N column, and we're going to group that information. I always recommend 5 groups. In this case, I'm just going to show you 3, but I recommend that you come up with 5 groups. And then having made 5 groups of A and 5 groups of N, you're going to name those groups. You'll label them so that you can keep yourself sorted out. Then, having sorted, you will choose whether you are arguing the affirmative or the negative side. Okay, so you choose your side. Then, having chosen, you will list those names that you came up with for the A or the N, whichever side you chose. You'll list those names basically as an outline. You will have main points. You'll have 5 main points. And then what you'll do finally is you will select members of each group as if the main point is a main point, then the members of the group are subpoints. We're going to call them not main points and subpoints, but we're going to call them proofs and subproofs. So we'll have a main point you'll see, and under that, which we'll call a proof, and then under that proof will be subproofs that defend that proof. Now those are the steps you take, and here's what you find out when you're done. You get to the end and voila, you have the material for an outline. In fact, you have more material than you need, so there's just one decision that you'll need to make, and that is of the 5 groups, which 3 will I use in the outline? So those are your steps. Make sure the I's are moved over, create A groups and name them, create N groups and name them, choose which side you're going to defend, then list that side by name, and then select the subproofs, and that's it. That's the lesson. So having overviewed it, let's actually step through that very briefly so that you can see an example, and that's what the board is here. I've already taken the invention work, the material that we came up with, and I've given signs to it. Now, when we talk about creating groups, that's how we're going to do it. We're going to give a little sign to every item in the group. And you'll notice here, beside white, which was pretty, you'll notice that there's a star there. Okay, so that's the first step. Look at the first item under the affirmative and give that item a star. I mean a sign. You decide on the sign. I put a star. White, which was pretty. Then I look at the next item and I see that Edmund was cold. And I ask myself, does Edmund was cold go with the white, which was pretty? Now somebody might say yes. And if they do, that's perfectly fine. I've said no because I don't think they do. I don't see it. And that's fine too. So I've started a second group, and I've put that little A with a circle around it. I forget the name. But Edmund was cold is my second group. Now I look at the third item, and I ask, the white which had candy. Does that go with the white which was pretty? Now again, somebody might say yes. I say no, but I say that it does go with Edmund was cold. And you might argue with me. Maybe you don't understand why I'm doing that. But it's my essay, so I get to do that. The fourth item is the white witch promised power to Edmund. Now, does that go with she had candy? Does it go with Edmund was cold? Does it go with she was pretty? Somebody's going to say yes. I say no. I'm going to use that to start a third group. And so you notice that by the time I get to my fourth item, I have 3 groups. And what I'm going to do now is just step my way down the list and ask, does each item go with any of the first? But actually, just do it one at a time. The white which was pretty, literally ask yourself every single item. Before you even form a second group, ask yourself every single item, does it go with the white which was pretty? Okay, and I go down and I see nothing else that goes with the white which was pretty. Then I go to my second group. Edmund was cold, and I go down the list, and you'll see I put with that the white which had candy. You'll see that I put with that the white which was nice to Edmund. You'll see that I added to that the white which took care of Edmund. And then I added Turkish Delight is candy, and it tastes good. White witch gave Edmund what was his, or was the white witch was in the book. It says the white witch was trying to give Edmund what was rightfully his, which is to say rule. Okay, so I'm saying that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 members of this list all go in this group here. And the main idea, or the first idea, maybe not the main idea, but the first idea is that Edmund was cold. Now I come to this item, the white witch promised power. And I'm going to step down my list, and you can see that by looking at each one individually, I added that the white witch was a queen. That goes with the white witch promised power. I added, and I used the ampersand, you can see, I added that there's a prophecy that Edmund would become king, and that goes with the white witch promised power and the white witch was queen. So that's my fourth group. Now my fifth group, I put the number, the pound sign, and that was Edmund was lost. And so I step down the list. I see the white witch knows Narnia. I decided that goes with Edmund was lost. Perhaps you can see why. Then I noted that the white witch tells Edmund that they are in Narnia. I see those 3 as going together. I also saw the white witch provides shelter to Edmund as something that goes in that same group. And that gives me a fourth group. And now I'm doing pretty well. I wanted 5 groups. I've got 4. And as I scan down the list, you'd notice if I was putting signs on as I was going down the list that there's only one item that isn't in one of those 4 groups, and it's the very last one. It is possible for Edmund to follow the white witch. Well, I give that a new sign, and in this case I use the percentage sign. Now you can use any sign you want. We use these signs because they're on the keyboard, and we wanted to show it in the teacher's guide. So it's easy to put those, but you can use any sign you want. The only sign I would not use is I wouldn't use numbers, because they can get messed up with priorities and so on. Now, so those 5 groups come under the A column. Now I come over to the N column. I've created my A groups, and I'm going to go now to my N column, and I'm going to see what goes together. And I have, first of all, Lucy warned Edmund. Edmund should not follow the white witch because Lucy warned Edmund about the white witch. And now I'm going to scan down. Boom, boom, boom. I look at each one. Now, do any of those go with that? Somebody's going to say yes. But I got all the way down to here. The beaver's called White Witch Evil before I found another one that I put in that group. And then I went down to here. The professor said Lucy doesn't lie. And then to here, the White Witch, a witch is usually evil in stories. Okay, usually evil in stories. And so 1, 2, 3, 4 items go together with Lucy warned Edmund. Then you'll notice that the next item was the witch was mean, the White Witch was mean, and the next 3, 6 items I put all together with the White Witch was mean. Then I went a space, and then I came to the White Witch is like Hitler. The White Witch is unlike Edmund's mother. It is always winter in Narnia because of the White Witch. And so those 6, 7, 8, 9 items make up my second group. And then you'll see the number sign is my third group. Edmund acted in secret, and Edmund snuck away, and so on. And I've got 4 items in that third group. Now, I ought to have 5 groups, but because of the example, I've only got the 3 here for this example, but I do have 5 for the affirmative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the affirmative side, and I'm going to go on to the next step. And to do that, I'm going to pull out my handy-dandy eraser over here, and I'm going to erase what's in the I column. Okay, and I'm going to use this space over here to name my groups from the A column and the N column. So first of all, let's look at the A groups. And you'll notice, first of all, that there's only one item under stars. So there's my group. The White Witch was pretty. I'll just put a 1 here. You don't have to, but I'll just do that. The White Witch was pretty. That's group 1. What's group 2? Okay, Edmund was cold. The White Witch had candy. The White Witch was nice to Edmund. The White Witch took care of Edmund. Turkish Delight is candy. White Witch gave Edmund what was rightfully his. I'm going to suggest that all of these come under the category of the White Witch was nice to Edmund. Okay, now somebody else will disagree and have a different title. That's fine. The White Witch was nice to Edmund. You could even come up with something that isn't one of the 5 groups. I'm sorry, one of the members of the group. You might say the White Witch was using Edmund to gain even more power. Maybe that's what comes to your mind as you're thinking of those things, and then these become subpoints. That's okay. That's fine to do that. The third group then is the White Witch promised power. I looked for the ampersand. She was queen, and there was a prophecy. And I'm going to suggest, this might sound funny to you, but I'm going to suggest that all of these have to do with Edmund wanted power. Okay, that's my third group. Now my fourth group then comes with my number sign. Edmund was lost. And here I can say the White Witch knows Narnia, can tell where they are in Narnia. She provides shelter. There's sort of a geographical thing going on here. So I'll just call this Edmund needed the White Witch's knowledge. That's what I'm going to call this. Edmund needed the White Witch's knowledge. And I'm talking here of geographical knowledge. But you can see by looking at that that's not one of the group members. But I have a group now that can fit under. And group number 5 is the last one here. It's possible for Edmund to follow the White Witch. Now, I've stepped through the A group and made the A column and made 5 groups out of it. If I were to do the same with the N group, we would just move it over here and we'd put 5 groups over here. And then here's a really important point. You should do that. Even though I'm not going to now, you should do that. And the reason you should do that is because after you've made the A list and the N list, then and only then your student decides which side will I argue for. Am I going to argue that Edmund should have followed the White Witch or Edmund should not have followed the White Witch? You don't let them decide until they have considered both sides of the issue. That's going to become very important practically in a later lesson when you do refutation. It's also very important in terms of just learning how to think through issues. Even though it may be an obvious answer, you need to think through both sides. So now, in the interest of time and space, I'm not going to go through the N column, but I trust you can see that you do exactly the same thing with N that you did with A to come up with 5 groups under under N. Now, and then you choose. Let me get my eraser again. Now at this point, we are going to be able to make an outline because we're going to list, well, we just did list the proofs by name, and now what we do is we pick the 3 best that we're going to use. Now, in this case, 1 in 5 only had 1 item. You could go back then and come up with more items if you really like, for example, that it is possible for Edmund to follow the White Witch. But I'm just going to go with these 3 for the very practical reason that I have something to say under them. But these then become the 3 proofs for my outline. And so what I'll do next is I'll list those as my 3 proofs. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to select members of each group as my subproofs, and that will be the material of my outline. Now at this point we're going to take a pause because we need to go on to make the outline. So I'm going to create some space here, and I'll show you how to take the information we've gathered here and sorted, and I'll show you how to turn that in a 2-step process into the outline. All right, I'm back. So what we've already done is we've sorted the A and the N into groups and so on, and we've decided on the A side, and so we're going to turn this, I said, into an outline. What I want to explain very clearly here is a distinction that's important, and that's the distinction between the order of development and the order of presentation. And here's what I mean by that. When they actually make the outline itself, imitating the template, that's the order of presentation, the order in which they will write their essay. They will present it to you. But to get to the order of presentation, there's an order of development. And for that, you always develop the proof first, the conclusion second, and the introduction last. And so as I present this lesson on outlining, on sorting and outlining, I'm only going to show you the proof and as an element of the outline. But please understand that that's because first I am going to develop the proof, and then I'm going to put it into the outline. And so in the student workbook, you'll notice that there's a worksheet B and a template. Worksheet B comes first, and that's where first you develop the proof, which is what we've been doing. Second, you develop the conclusion. And third and finally, you develop the introduction. Now, in later lessons, there will be more parts. But for now, that's what we'll leave it with. Proof, conclusion, introduction. And then on the template, you're shown the sequence by which you simply move it around so that the introduction is first, the proof is second, and the conclusion is third. So here's what we do. We've taken our affirmative, we've turned it into 5 groups. We circled, at least I just did, circled the 3 groups that we went with, and then we develop the parts of the proof. And what I would encourage you to do, what you should do here, is turn to the worksheet B, and you'll see that the first item on worksheet B is the proof. And really all you do there is pick up what you've got here, the circled groups and the subpoints, and you move them over. So if my first one is the White Witch was nice to Edmund, I'll write that. Of course, on the worksheet, you'll see you first write your thesis, but I'll write this is my first proof. And then I've got 3 supports that come from over here. He was cold, she gave him candy, and he had a rightful claim. So we could say cold, candy, and claim. She had a rightful claim. He had a rightful claim to the throne of Narnia. And so that's how we'll develop the proof. Now I just take my second point, and then I come up with my subpoints from here, and I move them over to point 2, which I won't bother doing in the interest of time. I take my third point, I move it over here, and I develop my subpoints, and now I've got, in effect, an outlined proof, and that's all done on worksheet B. Then, having completed my proof, 3 proofs with 3 subpoints under each, okay, then I write my conclusion following the pattern on the worksheet, and I write my introduction. Now, these are very rudimentary. As the year goes on, you will get more and more sophisticated at the conclusion and introduction. But for now, be content with proof, conclusion, introduction, and now what I do is I move from my worksheet B over to the template. I don't move it to the template. I imitate the template on my own paper. Now, the introduction is the first part, and you'll see that and it's on the worksheet, and there's a sample of this in your teacher guide. The introduction comes first, it's not on the board. Then comes the proof, okay? And then the conclusion, which also isn't on the board, okay? And so that's what the outline will look like. Roman numeral 2A, 1, 2, 3, B, 1, 2, 3, and C, 1, 2, 3. So that is how you move from the order of development to the order of presentation. And if you simply follow the steps provided in the teacher's guide, you'll find this relatively simple. The students will find it relatively simple. You'll probably find it really easy. And now what you've got is a nice organized essay, and all that's left is to express it appropriately, and that will be discussed under elocution. Thank you very much.